Yeah. Oh, okay, okay, okay. So can you hear? I'm good. Oh, okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. Firstly, I must apologize for the misunderstanding. I didn't understand the way the rooms are broken up. But now I see that the breakaway sessions is actually 3 different rooms of these 3 different speakers. I thought all these 3 speakers are in one place. So please forgive me about that. So my name is Pedro Mzileni. I teach sociology. I teach sociology at the University of the Free State, University of Zululand. Just for our audience in the room and also listening elsewhere, the University of Zululand is in the former homeland. It's classified in South Africa as a rural black university. Those are the post-colonial classifications that are still in place in South Africa. But we've turned it around with my community of scholars and students into an exciting research African university that provides high quality education and research to a working class community of black students. I don't know of any other university where it has a high population of students from a rural community, but I think our university is #1. A high community of students from a rural community are enrolled in our institution. So we are essentially providing high quality African research to the wretched of the earth. And it's a very exciting project, colleagues, that you will begin to see its results a few years down the line. So I teach sociology there, but my sociology is rooted more in international history and African thought. And this type of sociology has given me a lot of trouble with the higher education system of South Africa, but also with the white power system of South Africa and the rest of the world. I know even today my life is under threat for these questions. But I'll make this clear as I go. So I make my students read volumes of books on history for about 2 years. And then we theorize and give insights through the writing of essays and intense dialogues up to the 3rd-year level. That's the structure of our junior degree program. Now, some of my students don't like this, but many do because they see value down the line over the years. And I lean more towards zero tolerance for ChatGPT. Of course, we can't ignore it because we live in this global matrix of power that uses science and technology to reinforce coloniality today. But collectively with my students, we lean more towards zero tolerance. Precisely because Knowledge is not disconnected from what we do and how we think. There's no Chinese wall between thinking and doing. In fact, before my classes begin, the first 10 minutes with my students is dedicated on having a non-formal discussion on yeah, I was told the sound is only streaming to the online audience because of the breakaway rooms. So I'll try to project. I hope you will hear me. But have you at least heard the first part? All right. So I was saying there's no Chinese wall between thinking and doing. Usually the first 10 minutes of our classes with my students, we talk about the purpose of education and the value of the university before we proceed to the lesson. And I will talk a lot about my students, colleagues, and comrades because they are so important to my spiritual survival today. Whenever I'm around them, I get my life back. So they are such an important group of human beings in my life and what I do every day. So in other words, thinking is doing. Doing is thinking. That's why white people assassinated Steve Biko and Chris Hani for thinking, right? Because the minute your thinking is anti-colonial, there are material consequences immediately, right? Now, I'm going to use the term whiteness a lot when I talk, not only as a racial classification that privileges white people to create a white anti-black world system, but whiteness also as a geopolitical classification. In other words, Europe. Power must not only be white, but it must also be European, Eurocentric. Now, to make sense of some of the questions we're dealing with, you would have to go back to the Atlantic slave trade in the 16th century, because the rules of the global matrix of power that we're dealing with today were all set up during that period. Now, in the morning session by Professor Salim Vali and also Professor Tsepo Matlingozi, you heard a lot about 1492 and a series of events that took place thereafter. I don't know how many universities today drill deeper to the 1492 moment, but it's so crucial to understand the world we're dealing with today and the state of knowledge today, right? Now, obviously, my time is limited, so I will try by all means to be very, very brief because what is important for me is to have a conversation. So, 3 August 1492, Christopher Columbus sets off to the Americas and the project of land appropriations begins. In essence, Western civilization. And then afterwards, on 7 June 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas is signed by Pope Alexander VI, which essentially divided the world to between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. In other words, the epistemology of world direction, according to Western thought, started with that treaty. So the East for Portugal and the West for Spain, which today are still the dominant classifications of directions in the world. In South Africa, you have the Eastern Cape, the Western Cape. Before 1400, directions were studied differently by different civilizations, using their own insights. 15 April 1529, the Treaty of Zaragoza is now signed by the King of Spain, Charles V, and the King of Portugal, John III, which now not only divided the world into these directions and hemispheres I'm talking about, but they also finalized the giving of names to all the places they came across. Remember when Christopher Columbus found out about the Americas, or when Jan van Riebeeck arrived at the Cape, these people didn't know where they were in the world, right? The indigenous people knew the world. They knew the places, how the places function, you name it. These guys had no clue. And then that Zaragoza Treaty finalized that. During this period, it was still Portuguese and Spanish Empire. The British, French, and German Empire only came into the picture in the 1500s, the mid-1500s specifically. And then the Dutch later in the 1590s. But what is important to understand about this period is that the appropriation of lands also required labor. Because if you steal a huge amount of land, what are you going to do with it? You need to turn that land into value. In other words, mining, farming, which requires labor. And that was the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. Essentially, to build Europe and Western Empire from the labor and the intellect of African people. Now, this was a political and an economic project, but most importantly, Professor Valley, it was also an epistemic project. In other words, the Atlantic slave trade also introduced global linear thinking. And the logic of Western Christianity was used to justify these land appropriations. So in other words, we've went across the world to steal the land because the God Almighty has instructed us to introduce the new world to the civilization of God. And we are God, right? Now, to make people slaves and to exploit them, to appropriate their lands, you need another justification. And the second one that came thereafter was racism. You will work for us as cheap labor because you are dark. And we are white, we are pure, we come from heaven. We are the embodiment of God. You are dark, you are the color of hell. So you shall be labor in this system. Then, international law that we know today was introduced to justify these rules that were already set in place. So international law came through precisely in the 16th century to justify land appropriation and slavery, what we call today private property. Now, the Industrial Revolution, therefore, now of the 17th century, now that included the British, the Dutch, the French, and all these empires, started with the rules of colonial rule already in place. that if you are black and if you are a woman, you shall be labor in the world market system. If you're white and Eurocentric, therefore you shall own the means of production. But an important aspect about the Industrial Revolution was that not only must labor be black, but labor itself must be a commodity. And this is a very important aspect now, because when you say labor is a commodity, who is labor? Labor is human beings, right? It's people. But what is a commodity? A commodity is something that is disposable. You just take it and use it for a particular period. Once you're done with it, you get rid of it. So in the 17th century, something happens unprecedented in world history. Human beings became labor, but human beings became disposable. And those human beings were in the colonies. So to be black was to be easily disposable, right? So the project of genocide that is attached to the colonial project essentially comes from this global linear thinking of human beings being disposable. So once you understand these things, then Marikana will make sense, right? Sharpeville will make sense. And all kinds of genocides that took place in the colonies from the 17th century all the way up until today. Palestine now will make sense, because this is the global matrix of linear thinking that informed these kinds of atrocities. But where now I want to focus on as my last point, so that we can have a conversation, is the grip of coloniality today on knowledge, right? And in the terrain of knowledge, it's a place where Biko says it's the most potent weapon of the enemy force. In other words, the colonization of the mind. And one of the sites of struggle where this is taking place today is the university. It takes place in the university in two dominant ways. One, the university today is increasingly becoming a terrain of polite scholarship and the normalization of white supremacy. When you listen to the public thought in South Africa, and also the writings that emerge from the university today, you would think at one point that it's as if land dispossession didn't happen in this country, right? You would think that when colonial rule ended on the planet, the last nation state to receive independence from colonial rule was South Africa in 1994. From all the 54 member states in Africa, most of them got their independence from colonial rule in the 1960s. 1960 to be precise, because in 1960 there were 17 nation states in total that got independence that year. So that's why in Africa we normally say our political independence was in 1960. But 1960 in South Africa, Steve Biko is still alive, Robert Sobukwe is still alive, Nelson Mandela is not yet sent to Robben Island at that time. So the atrocities still continued in South Africa right into the 70s and the 80s. And South Africa was the last nation state in Africa to obtain independence from colonial rule in 1994. Mozambique, 1975, Zimbabwe, 1980, Namibia, 1990, And then there was this last guy, 1994. But the shocking thing is, in the university of this nation state that was the last one to obtain independence, the scholarship is so polite around white supremacy. Right? The scholarship is so polite around questions of white supremacy, not only in South Africa, but across the whole globe. It's so surprising that the Palestine genocide is not an everyday conversation in the classroom in South Africa. There are reasons for this, right? The reason is that Eurocentric coloniality as a hegemonic knowledge project is something that is greatly rewarded in South Africa. So if your scholarship is about liberal reconciliation, liberal social justice, that scholarship receives all kinds of financial support in South Africa. But the scholars who teach about Black consciousness philosophy, radical Black feminism, Pan-Africanism, those scholars are harassed. They are threatened with suspensions. They are undermined for promotions. They get isolated from crucial networks in the university. And this has implications for broader society as well, because the public popular discourse in South Africa itself, it continues with the very same logic. So challenges of violence, unemployment in South Africa are not attached to the colonial problem, right? They are made as recent things that present Black people as the problem. Not problems facing Black people, presenting Black people as a race as the problem. That is at the core of the hegemonic scholarship taking place in South Africa today. So, in my case now, when I was teaching at the University of the Free State from November 2022 to December 2023, if you don't know the story, please follow it up this evening. It's all over the internet. But the scholars and the activists who were involved in that resistance are in the room. And I want to appreciate each of them for the work you all did for us to win that war against the racists and the right wing of South Africa and the globe. So I want to appreciate each one of you for the role you played. But in the Free State, for those who are not aware, it's in the former colony called the Orange Free State. The orange gives it away. It has historical epistemic roots to Dutch Empire. There's a high concentration of white people there. And their belief is white people as a race, they must remain a majority in a university. Firstly, numerically, which is quite a narcissistic orientation of thought. Because how do you want to be white and dominant in Africa as settlers, first and foremost? Because your arrival and presence in Africa is illegitimate. It comes from an unspeakable crime. And you need to understand that, right? Because if you don't, there are going to be material consequences in your life when Black people become conscientized one day, right? So they want to be a majority, firstly. Precisely because the apartheid project presented a manipulation viewpoint of communities in South Africa. So white people are only 4%, 5% of the population, but they want to dominate institutions in Africa. And the only way for them to achieve that was through the system of apartheid. Because apartheid said, yes, you are in the African continent where people are racialized black, but we're going to create a system where black people are going to be driven out from social institutions. And they are only going to be occupied by people who are racialized white. That was only possible through the legal system of apartheid, right? Otherwise, in a normal democratic society, no institution in Africa is supposed to be dominated by white people because you are in Africa. So ordinarily and automatically, all social institutions are supposed to be dominated by Africans. Even if you're looking for excellence, excellence is not a racial category. Excellence is random. It's random. You can get excellence anywhere, right? Now, if excellence can be found anywhere, who is anywhere in Africa? Anywhere in Africa automatically would be African people because they are the majority of the population, right? So this thing of having a Springbok team in a starting lineup of 22 players and 21 are white in an African country, that is rubbish. You know? If excellence was random, each and every single component of life in Africa was going to be dominated by African people. So at the end of the Free State, there's that white narcissistic racist logic that although white people are only 5% of the population, they must dominate the teaching research staff in an African country, right? 2, the knowledge offered must be Eurocentric. I spoke earlier on about whiteness not only being a color, but also a geopolitical classification. So if you walk into the classroom and you teach sociology from Europe, then you are a good academic. But if you teach the sociology of Kwame Nkrumah and Steve Biko that centralizes black people as thinkers, then you're a problem. And for doing that work at the University of the Free State, I was chased down from one disciplinary hearing after the other. Teaching African history in Africa at the University of the Free State is categorized as reverse racism. So if I say in the classroom, white people killed Chris Hani, it's regarded as offensive. Who killed Chris Hani? I mean, racism is a sickness. It even wants to distort history. You can't change history. The role of an intellectual is to only interpret and explain history, right? One random morning, 10 April 1993, a white lunatic took a gun and killed an innocent man whose mission in life was to create a world with a human face. Now, why would a person who wants to create a world with a human face be considered a threat to be killed? Right? So, racial global linear thinking is dangerous. That's why it needs to be fought in the battlefield and be destroyed. Because if there's no fight against it, it is going to create a chaotic world that we see today. Thinking is doing. Doing is thinking. When I won the cases at the University of the Free State, the white right wing escalated the matter to the South African Human Rights Commission, a constitutional body, a national constitutional body in South Africa. Guess what? The South African Human Rights Commission received the complaint from AfriForum and it said it's a valid complaint. We are going to help you, AfriForum, to investigate this lecturer. There's a high probability that indeed he is teaching white genocide. A South African Human Rights Commission, a constitutional body in a post-colonial society that received independence recently, 1994, believes that indeed African historians are teaching distorted knowledge in the university. I don't know how many millions the Human Rights Commission spent on the case, but I was chased down for a year. I was asked, Professor Valley, to present my PhD, to present all my research that I've done, to present my research, my study guides, the tests I make students write. I was even asked, when you teach, how do you sound like? Right? So I had to explain to the South African Human Rights Commission that this is my PhD thesis. This is how I wrote it on page 3, right? 1492, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed by Pope Alexander VI. I had to explain that to them. An African scholar, right? A year later, they emailed a report to me and AfriForum saying they found no evidence of any crime, I'm free. That report was never published publicly by the South African Human Rights Commission. It was emailed to me and the lawyers of AfriForum, as if nothing happened in the country, as if no damage was done to me and my family, as if no damage was done to my career, right? So that is the type of a society we are dealing with. So people watching from the outside who are wondering what we're doing in the university, please try to reconsider from today. We are putting our lives on the line for the education of the African child. Thank you so much.